Hello and welcome to the IdeaCast interview series, episode number 74. My guest in this episode is Dr. Joan Walton, and Dr. Joan is a senior lecturer at the School of Education, Language and Psychology at York St. John University, and she's also a PhD supervisor, and she'll explain more about where she is presently and a little bit about her past in the beginning of our conversation. I met Joan through a group email or a thread established by Professor Greg Enriquez at James Madison University, and it revolves around his UTalk work, and there is an interview in my catalog with him, and you can learn more about that. But Joan and I met that way. We had a conversation together. We got together for what I call a pre-meet, and we hit it off really well, and I thought, yes, this is going to be a lovely interview. So I hope that you find that as well in this conversation that she and I had. I suspect you will, and I very much enjoyed having her as a guest. So enjoy, and thank you as always for watching my interviews and conversations. And I'd like to welcome Dr. Joan Walton to the IdeaCast interview series. Really looking forward to a meaningful and thoughtful conversation. Joan, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Justin. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yes, and we are going to have a conversation that I will now acknowledge the YouTube audience and thank you all for being here, that I think will be very fruitful and meaningful, because to the YouTube audience, I will say that most of you have come to me through some of the philosophers that I've interviewed, and this conversation will be working through these ideas that some of the folks that I've brought on board, Bernardo Castro and Matt Siegel and a handful of others that have talked about some matters of mind, spirit, and so forth. So that's what you're going to be experiencing with us. And so again, I welcome you all. So Joan, I think maybe the best thing to do right now is just to start with a quick little introduction of who you are and some things that you're doing in present time. And then, as I alluded to just a second ago, we'll get going into some interesting stuff.
Yeah, well, thank you, Justin. That's a really good opening and a welcome. I work in very diverse places. I think what I'm going to start with is that the interest that brought me to have the conversation with you in the first place was in the nature of consciousness, in what consciousness is. And I have been recently very influenced by Bernardo Castro in these kind of ideas. But my interest in consciousness actually goes way back to when I was 19 and read Carl Jung's autobiography, Memories, Dreams and Reflections. And that got me into the idea of the active imagination and into depth psychology. And so I started exploring my own consciousness in great depth. So my interest has always been experiential as well as theoretical. And I realize that's not answering your question. That's not saying where I am now, but I think I just wanted to say that where I've come to now has got very long and deep roots. Mm-hmm. Where I am at the moment is I'm a researcher and doctoral supervisor at York St. John University, which, for those of you who are not in the UK, is in the northeast of England, quite in a very historic town. York is a lovely place, and the university is in the middle of this historic place. So I've been there since about last 6 years, and my main role, as I say, is in supervising PhD students and what we call EdD students, professional doctorates. Okay. Those are students who are grounding their research in their own professional practice, and within that context I am trying to introduce ideas of ontology, epistemology within the research methodology, and through that context to introduce people to ideas of consciousness. As well as that, I'm also involved with the Aleph Trust, which is accredited by Liverpool John Moores University, which is on the northwest of England. And I'm involved in their PhD program in applied transpersonal psychology. In addition to that, I'm a member of the board of directors of the Scientific and Medical Network, which is an international organization that looks at the relationship between science and spirituality, and a member of the steering group for the Galileo Commission, which is particularly interested in the science of consciousness. And then finally, in terms of different activities at the moment, I'm the chair of the executive committee of the International Network for the Study of Spirituality. So I think you'll see from that, Justin, that my interests are quite diverse and across a span of organizations.
I would say for sure, indeed. And that is, I think, in our modern, whatever phase of modernity we're in, that having a broad perspective like that is important, especially one when we can say on the other side we have, speaking of modernity, we have the ideas of materialism, of physicalism, the sort of religion of scientism or the philosophy of scientism, to be a little less polemic, and there is, I think, a hunger in, hopefully in academia, but also in the sort of mid-range, where people who are curious and are seeking meaning, that this is a fertile ground, that this is a really rich territory. And again, this is the bulk of the constituency of my show, and the guests that I bring on is about this meaning-making, sense-making system. And so, yeah, you bring this multifaceted both inquiry and sets of proposals and speculations of what a healthier ontology or epistemological systems and tools and processes might look like. So what you're doing, in my opinion, and from the others that I've had on board, this is good medicine for modern times. And so I'll acknowledge you and validate for me the worth in what you do and what you bring, especially if you are working as a PhD advisor, that this is so essential. This is something that if I had any capacity to be influential, it would be to those who are young right now, who have the door still open for the most part, and by default or naturally. I mean, all of us can change at any time in our lives. So yeah, having that positive impact on younger folks to help their trajectory a little bit. So yes, in acknowledging Bernardo and his reworking of idealism, sounds like you were primed, being introduced to Jung, that this was a good fit. This just fit in for you. Do you want to talk a little bit about how Bernardo's work impacted your life and your trajectory?
I can do, but if I just return to the role that you were talking about at the university, what I think I omitted to say was that I'm in the School of Education, Languages and Psychology, and that I am fundamentally an educator and write and research within education context from early years right up until when people are older. And my PhD candidates, oddly enough, are not all young. There are very many, and interestingly enough, because of the kinds of things we're studying, I think many people come to these ideas later in life rather than earlier. So actually, quite a number of my PhD students are in their 50s and 60s. So it just shows that it's never too late for people to come and study the kind of things that interest them when they've had a perhaps career either in education, or they've become interested in ideas of spirituality or wherever that lies. And yes, I quite openly talk about these ideas of consciousness. So going back to your question, as I said, in working with Carl Jung and in getting involved with ideas of the active imagination and exploring my own deep forms of consciousness, I came to realize that there was definitely more to life than met the eye. So I think what has progressed over time is this sense of, as an educator, wishing to share ideas about what I call a post-materialist worldview. In other words, at a very early age, I really came to understand that consciousness was not dependent on the brain for its existence, that there's a correlation between experiences of consciousness and brain activity, but there is absolutely no evidence to show, in fact, it seems impossible to prove that the brain is responsible for generating consciousness. And to use an analogy that has been applied by others, that it's a little bit like a radio. If you switch the radio off, or if you break the radio and the music goes, that doesn't mean that the music has disappeared. The music is still out there on the airways somewhere. So you've got to separate off the source of the music and the medium through which it is being communicated.
Mm-hmm.
So Jung has been very, provided the foundation for my active exploration in all of those ideas, which also introduced me into kind of ideas of spirituality, into spiritual experiences. And in fact, I did my own PhD very late in the day in 2008. And that was, in fact, a narrative account of my own spiritual journey. So I'd got to, if you like, an advanced state of my own career, and I'd been doing all of this kind of exploration, both experientially and theoretically, and it was just, I just felt all over the place, and I felt I needed to in some way structure my own understanding, and I needed an incentive to do that, really. So I signed up for a PhD, which really encouraged me to reflect, sit back, think about what's the journey that I had been on through my life. And it gave an account of the different experiences I'd had, going back to my childhood, but also starting with Carl Jung, but into my later interests, which came to quantum physics. So it was a very interdisciplinary thesis, which covered quantum physics, science of consciousness, consciousness studies, Eastern and Western philosophies, social sciences, philosophy. I'm sure I've forgotten something in there, but as you can see, it was pretty diverse in terms of the topics, and just really, as I say, was a narrative account of my spiritual journey from a very young age through to the point I was at then. So that was an educational experience for me, actually, and sat equally, if you like, in terms of an account of the experiences that informed me, or this has informed my thinking, and also taking the theory that helped me make sense of those kind of experiences. And it has been relatively recently that I've come across Bernardo Castro in the last couple of years. And I would say that I think the reason I've been drawn to him particularly is that his theorizing is probably the closest to reflecting my own ideas and my own thinking about that. And he's just so articulate. I wish I had his gift of articulating an understanding of the nature of reality and the arguments for it. So I'm kind of very grateful to him, because he's such a master at articulating these things. I think just to kind of summarize where I'm at in terms of my own theoretical basis, because I do believe that we live in a purposeful universe. I do believe that consciousness has a sense of purpose in it. There's an intention for it. And I've thought long and hard about how I summarize this, and my overall theoretical stance is that consciousness is eternal and infinite, and it has within it the core qualities of love and creativity. And so those ideas of love and creativity are integrated into what is. And my sense is that what emerges, what evolves from them, are expressions of the eternal and infinite, and that love and creativity manifest into beauty, goodness, truth, all the other aspects. So that's my theoretical orientation.
Yeah, and again, that and thank you for presenting that. And that really resonates again with the thesis that I'm trying to work with. I am by nature agnostic. So this is all beautiful wonder and speculation and things like that, speculation in the best possible meaning of the word. But I think it drives us closer to, I don't like to use the word truth, but it drives us closer to some sort of sense of community, of sense of togetherness. Like you said, love, truth, and beauty, which I think are incontrovertible modes or phases of being, and that's good aspirational work, in my opinion. So thank you for that. And to acknowledge your comment about Bernardo, I think his corpus callosum is just finely tuned. It's like a nice Ferrari of corpus callosums, because he, like, to invoke Ian McGilchrist for a minute, there's a left brain, right brain thing that you can see as being quite literal, or as being a good heuristic for how we function as these metacognitive apes and people that move about the world with the ability to reflect and hope and regret and all these things. But I think he has that onboarding of the ability to use that sort of reasoning center that he has, that's was good for him in doing his work as a computer scientist and working with AI and things like that, but also having the heart to understand that it isn't all just little marbles bouncing off each other, and that it's all very nihilistic and good luck, kid, and all that kind of stuff. So the hard-hearted nature of certain ideas or truths that we could arrive at if we take meaning out of life. So, and then the other thing, and I want to not try to break the continuity of what you were just saying, but when these folks over 45 are getting their PhDs, is it for a sort of renaissance completion, satisfying of a desire, or are they going back into academia and school and scholarship to work with people, or is this more just like a renaissance project for them?
This is them deciding at a later stage in their life that they want to engage in some kind of study that is meaningful for them. So they are in the main doing engaged in professional work still. So if I give you one example, I have a current student, Janice, who was also a colleague, and my latest publication, in fact, which is about developing a relational pedagogy in early years, has been co-researched and co-written with her. And her background through her whole life has been as an early years teacher and then a consultant. And there's many people, professionals in the UK, probably in other parts of the world, but certainly in the UK, who are very unhappy about the system, the education system for early years and school children, in fact, right through the education system, because we mentioned a materialist worldview, we mentioned scientism, and they translate into things like targets and measured outcomes. And I've got a young granddaughter who's just being subjected to this form of targeted, they have to speak by a certain point in time, they have to spell, they have to read, and the issue of just being a child and just enjoying play gets neglected rather. And Janice feels very strongly about all of this, and we've been co-researching the early years, and so she decided to do this as a PhD because she felt so passionate about it. And she is talking about, she's researching the ideas that early years professionals or early years practitioners, who are very often completely lack value in our society. Anybody can look after young children, can't they? If you fail at school and you're not successful at anything else, well, and you've got a kind heart, well, you can look after children. But actually, it's much more important than that. What happens to children in their early years is fundamentally important, and very many skilled people are in the role. So Janice has been looking at the idea of early years being knowledge creators. They should be the people who are creating the knowledge about the young people, and not the experts who kind of have got the qualifications and never really interact with young people, but like to theorize about them. And so she's about to submit this year, and it's a very exciting thesis, and it comes from that deep passion recognition. But she's also doing that, she's exploring the ontology, so she's also doing that within an idea of a kind of participatory consciousness, and she's including with that the kind of challenges both to neoliberalism as a political ideology, but also to scientism as a different kind of materialist ideology, and sees the two as being related.
Okay. And you write about, in my doing research on your work, you've written about that, and I appreciate that in your work. And to the YouTube audience, I'll have links down below to anything that's open access in the literature that we can get of Dr. Walton's, and anything else that might lend itself. If you do a YouTube search for Joan Walton, there's oh gosh, what was his name? He has several of your there's little short lectures and talks and things like that. But anyway, I'll make sure all that's available to you. There's a playlist of Joan's work in there. So I had something that I was going to bring out of what you just mentioned. Oh, are you familiar with Donna Thomas? She's a collaborator or a member of the Donna, yeah.
Dr.
Donna
I know
Thomas.
Donna.
Okay.
She and I have spoken together, and in fact, I did edit a journal which some of your watchers might be interested in submitting articles to, the International Journal for Transformative Research. And the Scientific and Medical Network did a special issue of that for people looking at ideas of post-materialist education. Okay. And Donna submitted a very interesting paper to that special issue. So yes, we've spoken on a number of occasions.
I had a feeling. I had a feeling you two were connected. And she just posted, she's in the Netherlands right now, so maybe she's at a conference or something. Okay. And I'm glad you mentioned the transformative research, because one of the articles in the literature that I read by you was transformative and transpersonal research. And there were three kind of key points of that research. Can we unpack that since you've mentioned it, and talk about that as a good example of what you're referring to?
Yeah, do you want to ask me specific questions, Justin? Because it's a long time since I both wrote and published that, so I'm not absolutely certain.
Yeah, I think it was 2016 or 20. So I understand. So in my notes, you had the intuitive, integral, and organic inquiry as methods embedded in, but maybe to define how the context of the connotation of transpersonal in this sense, which is what it sounds like, but in the sense of research. So it's more of a holistic research vis-a-vis the sort of Newtonian materialist format or methodology.
And yeah, these ideas of the transpersonal, I mean, it's running counter to traditional ideas of research. So if you go back in research, positivism, the idea that reality exists independently of us, and we can stand there as independent researchers and observe and explain exactly what is going on as though we don't affect what goes on at all. And that has, of course, been very severely challenged both within science itself, because quantum physics, it shows the double slit experiment, shows incontrovertibly that the observer influences that which he or she observes. And if anyone's not aware of that experiment, look it up, because it's really fundamentally challenges the whole concept of the separation of the observer and the observed. And I've lost track then. Just remind me what I was saying.
Sure. So you were grounding transpersonal research in the idea of the interconnectedness of the quantum, and emerging from that into a world of connectedness.
I'm back again. Yes. So the mainstream research was about positivism. Well, of course, within the humanities and arts, there's qualitative research now. So people talk about, constructing reality, the social construction of reality, and we can't know objectively. We can only have a subjective knowledge, and there's as many perspectives as there are people perceiving reality. But that doesn't allow for the transpersonal. In the main, most qualitative forms of research are still grounded in materialist ontologies. But when you come to the transpersonal, and it's quite interesting because I said I was involved in the doctoral program on applied transpersonal psychology. And at the moment, the researchers on that are exploring this idea of the transpersonal. And there are many different ideas about what the transpersonal actually means. And I have to say, I think I was quite surprised myself at the wide range. There doesn't seem to be any kind of consensus about what we understand by the transpersonal. What I understand by it is that we inhabit a reality that's greater than ourselves, and that we connect to each other, not just as, you know, entities across space and time. But if we go back to my original idea that consciousness is primary, then in fact we are immersed in consciousness, and that there's some form of communication, which explains things like telepathy, etc., etc. And so those forms of research that you were talking about, intuitive inquiry, acknowledges the kind of internal dimensions of our worlds, and recognizes the validity of our internal realities and how we can access those as a means of gaining knowledge, and see that as a valid form of research. And in fact, I really should acknowledge her. Those kind of methods come from Rosemary Anderson, and she's written books on transpersonal research methods. So people who are interested in that article that I talked about has the reference to her, and she's written very extensively on those kind of methodologies. But yes, they allow for the reality of the transpersonal within one's view of the world, and provide a very detailed way of using those kind of research methods to research practice.
And from the transpersonal, then it allows for the transformative research. So in other words, if you went down strictly down that Newtonian hard linearity of empiricism, etc., that this transformative space is opened up for a broader range of discoveries, perhaps, than just that one mode of inquiry, right? Is that true? Is that landing on that?
I think if you believe that there is a reality beyond that which we can experience with our five senses, and you wish to explore that reality, then in a sense you're exploring the idea of the transpersonal. And going back to our mention, our understanding of consciousness, which has different ways of understanding it and using that term, obviously. But my experience is that when people start exploring at the transpersonal level, it has a transformative impact. And transformation to me is a shift in consciousness which does not revert. So, for example, if you get drunk one night and you experience a great shift in consciousness and you're operating at a different level, when you wake up the next morning, you're back to normal again. That you're back to where you were the previous night. But if you have an experience that is transformative, then the definition of that is that it creates a shift in your consciousness, a shift in your way of understanding things, from which you don't revert, you just move on to the next phase.
And that speaks to something you had brought up in those lectures that I referenced that are on YouTube, and you were talking about almost a circularity, but it's iterative, but it's never repeating. So it's based on a buildup of, and I think this relates to what you were just saying, a buildup of new, we could call it data or new X, and that further information, that further being informed, advances you to the next circle of inquiry or mode of inquiry. And
well, in
so
that sense, I think you could be talking about a form of, in professional terms, in research methodology, I would call that action research.
Okay.
Or if I'm working with colleagues, would form a form of collaborative inquiry,
yes.
or cooperative inquiry. And in fact, for my own PhD thesis, I did a cooperative inquiry with a group of others in which we explored what we understood by transformative living. So that word transformative again. And we met for 5 weekends a year in a really beautiful setting, and for 3 consecutive years. And that was as much experiential as it was. But the point of action research, and I think I live my life like this actually, is that you have an experience, you reflect on that experience, and you reflect what it means for you, but then you think about what worked well, what was good about that experience, what wasn't good about that experience, and how might I have wanted it to be different? And so you then start conceptualizing. And if you're doing this academically, you start drawing on the literature, on the books that you read, on the people that you've listened to, on the webinars that you've heard, and it helps you develop your thinking and ideas. So we've talked about Bernardo Castro. So in many ways, he's kind of helped me refine and think through some of my ideas. And then it gives you ideas for different ways of living, or different ways of perceiving life, or different ways of approaching people or perceiving people. And then you go back into the world and try out new ways of being. And that brings you to a different order of experience. And that's a cyclical process, because you're hopefully evolving your own consciousness. You're hopefully evolving the wisdom that you have about the way that you live your life, and if you're approaching that in a positive way, it moves you on to other ideas and other ways of being. If that makes sense.
It does. It does. I see that as a multi-dimensional evolution. You know, sometimes
Absolutely.
we think of evolution as being a straight line, but this is, to use a Cartesian graph, there's multiple axes that you're just expanding out on those axes, and it's, you know.
And if you're doing that experientially, if you're doing that with the whole of your body and mind and spirit, I think people talk about this idea of an evolution of consciousness. And I think this whole process, especially if we can engage in this collaboratively, can help us in an evolution of consciousness, which I think is a concept that's becoming increasingly understood, and the realization that we need it. I mean, if you look at the world out there and the various crises, the things that are threatening us, the environmental crisis, climate change, the levels of poverty that exist, the terrorism that continues, everything that's going on with Putin and in Russia, we need a radical shift in consciousness on a global scale. And to me, it starts at the grassroots up. You know, it's often said one person at a time, but for me, then, if you can engage collaboratively with others and work with others and think, what can we do in our part of the world or in our part of the community, and together you contribute to that evolution of consciousness.
One thing I do to try to make sense of the world as it is, as you've just described, is to use a kind of scaling method to see the nearly blank slate of our children as the place to start with what we're pointing towards here. And people in our age range, there's still hope. There's still, you know, time to reframe, to change the lens or whatever. But I'm most hopeful in that and this is kind of the base or the ground floor of this conversation, is that if in those first 12 to 15 years of a person's life, that this kind of thinking can be facilitated by the right teaching method or the right system, as you pointed out, in probably and in the United States and in the UK and probably other areas, that you know, there are some necessary things about, you know, dealing with the reality of modern life, but this idea of a broader perspective on how to use our resources, how to relate to others, how to understand boundaries, how to understand a more positive affect system of being, however that wants to be articulated, that it starts in the minds of those who are just starting to starting to form and congeal into thinking persons and analyzing persons and persons who will be evolving in that system. And so, to me, that seems critical if we are to address our present day problems. That you know, and of course, we may not have 25 years to bring these people up, but that to me is where the first radical shift might have the best traction. But then again, there is a system in place now, as you pointed out, and I just acknowledged that, you know, is that kind of compassion and that awareness and that care being offered to that generation, those people, and concomitantly we can scale back out towards, again, our age range, where we have to take this seriously, and but again, there's I was listening to I don't know if you follow John Schmachtenberger and Liz Boree were in a conversation the other day about a lot of this stuff and about the stigmergy and the social gravity and the momentum, the boulder rolling down the hill kind of thinking that, and Noam Chomsky pointed this out. I'll make a good reference. Like if the executive CEO at Exxon suddenly realized, oh crap, I'm destroying the planet, I can't do this anymore, that vacuum would be replaced in a nanosecond by the next sociopathic, leader, captain of industry that steps up and says, there's no such thing as a climate. What do you get out of here? There's $400 trillion worth of oil we can extract, and think of how many planes that's going to buy everybody. So it's like, you just get this, sense of hopelessness that stigmergy or that inertia is there. So I'm always more hopeful that if we can help build that salience amongst the young ones, that don't do what we did, please, and retract. And I'm rambling too much here, but it's just like this is something I struggle with a lot. And it's like, well, how do we imbue upon these young ones, give them the education they need to live in a modern world, a world with AI and quantum computing and yada yada yada, but nonetheless, where do we center that ethics and compassion and all those things? So anyway, I'll stop because I've been rambling, but that's something I'm struggle with.
You're connecting to something that is an absolute passion of mine, and I've alluded to it already. Obviously, is early years, is the first few years of life, and I think they need to take priority in our society, because what happens then, I mean, it's a little bit of a chicken and egg situation, isn't it? Because they get older and get imbued in society. You've got to have enlightened people who work in the early years. And as I said, working with Janice, and we've just written this article, which is basically saying that we need to introduce a relational pedagogy at all levels. But I started life as my working life following school as a social worker. So I actually went straight before university, but after school, I went and worked at a residential care home for children. And it was prior to the 40-hour week. There's now a limit to 40 hours of a working week, even with people working in residential childcare. But that was when you went and you lived in the job. So I went straight as a relatively naive 18-year-old to living with 8 very dysfunctional, disadvantaged, deprived young children. And there were 3 of us. There was myself at 18, and Jan at 21, and Tess at 23. And between the 3 of us, we had the care of these children. And it was like a real shock to the system. I mean, if I say there was one family of 4 for a while, and the mother was in long-term psychiatric hospital, and the father was in prison for going for the head teacher with an axe, attempted murder. And so we had the 4 children, and they were in various ways extremely deprived. The older boy kind of wrecked everywhere through furniture. The younger boy was very quiet and sat in a corner, but then nobody paid him any attention. And then one day he just flipped and acted exactly like his older brother. So that taught me a very hard lesson in terms of make sure you pay attention to all children, even when they're being quiet and well behaved. And the younger one was 5. And I remember thinking at the time, I can hardly believe that I'm saying it's possible for a young child to be evil. And looking back, I'm not saying he was, but his eyes were just communicated, and he was very, very devious even at that age. And I stayed there 2 years, but it completely depressed me, actually. It's the fact that it was possible for children to live like this. And I really thought we need to create a world where this is not possible. And later on, I worked with Bernardo's, which is a national charity, which most people will have heard of, and with young offenders. and I realized at that point that it was too late. When you start working with teenagers, it's too late. It needs to be the kind of early years, so that what happens in early years settings and the kind of behaviors and values they encounter then is really important. So the work that I've been doing recently, and the work that we've been doing with early years practitioners, is about as we mentioned earlier, developing a relational pedagogy based on the idea of a participatory consciousness. And we're trying to work with practitioners and parents in a way that introduces them to this kind of expanded worldview and a kind of theoretical way of understanding the world that helps them to understand and work with young children. And if I just say that the first project that Janice and I were working with, we did a kind of collaborative inquiry with early years practitioners in terms of enabling them to value themselves as knowledge creators, actually. And after 12 months, it was looking at what they had identified for themselves. And there was one main message came through, was that every moment counts. That became a real mantra for them. Every moment counts. And they became very conscious that if, for example, a practitioner comes into a nursery and is very stressed because of what's happening at home and a row they've had with their boyfriend, and gets irritable with the child doesn't understand that they're acting out the stress that they had at home. What the child takes in is, oh, this person is angry with me and upset with me, what have I done wrong? And they take on board the kind of guilt of that and the belief that they have done something wrong. And so just generating an awareness that every single moment in a child's life is important, makes an important contribution to whether they move on in a positive way or whether they take on some message which is detrimental to their own well-being. So that's really just saying how important I think those early years are.
It's almost as though a little dose of evolutionary thinking might lend a good sense of imagery that a child, through introjection, is just wicking everything up, in real time. Everything's brought in, and they don't have that psychological complexity to nuance and say, as you just pointed out, mommy's upset because, mommy had drama somewhere else, and now she's going to project it onto me. And we all had that from all. I don't think there's been a single mother alive that's ever been free of that. But that this has to be accounted for. That child's mind is just taking everything in from the environment to help it survive and help it to be a successful functioning adult. And I'm not going to go too Darwinian on that, but I think that's part of our onboarding upbringing process.
But people have this tendency to think that young children are resilient, and this has come through very strongly in COVID, actually, because we did some research, a research project on the impact of COVID on young children, and a lot of the views was to say, well, they don't really notice or they don't really understand and they're resilient. But actually, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that they absorb the feelings of the adults around them. So in a sense, it's inevitable that they're going to pick up the fear and the anxiety. And actually, that's coming through now when certainly in our primary schools and other forms where children are at, they're seeing the mental health problems of young children has increased dramatically, and there are still attendance issues at school and signs of depression, etc. So I think people are realizing, because we see COVID as a cultural trauma. It's been named as a cultural trauma, so the impact has been on all children. So understanding that young children experience trauma from a range of directions, and very often it can be unwittingly in their own homes. People tend to think childhood trauma is just about severe abuse or neglect or poverty, but actually the kind of things we've been talking about, if a child constantly feels diminished in any way, or it can be in a really good family, in a really good home, but just unwittingly they get compared unfavorably to another child, or something happens to an animal they're fond of and it's not picked up and understood properly, that there can be other kinds of traumatic events that have an impact on them. So the more we become sensitized to the world of young children and understand that, I think it's really important.
I have a good example. I don't mean to laugh at it, but there's a daycare center two doors down from me on an intersection, and it's a private, small. There's like 30 kids there, and they go out and play every day, 3-4 times a day. And my wife and I were out working in our neighbor's yard, which is adjacent by way of a street, and we were both, our jaws were on the ground because there were half a dozen kids who were pummeling each other, and it wasn't just a little 3-minute brawl. It was just continual for 15 or 20 minutes. And they would chase and they would stop, they'd reorganize. And it wasn't that one kid was the, because when I was a kid, there was always one kid that was the punching bag in the neighborhood. And it depended on it's just, we rotated. Like I'd be the punching bag and I'd get the crap beat out of me. I don't think this is too dramatic from any of the history of human children, but we were just astonished that this went on and on and on. And it was these roles being played and this kind of acting out. And again, I suspect it was because they come from these households where mom and dad are pummeling each other on Saturday night after too much drink or something like that. But it did remind me of my childhood, because we used to throw rocks at each other. I went to a very nice Waldorf school as a child for about 2 years at the cathedral in Washington, D.C. And it was a beautiful place, but there were these labyrinth gardens, very, very, very nice, very British looking gardens, very European gardens. But we had nothing better to do but pick up rocks and we'd throw them at each other. It wasn't because we were angry. It was sport. It was war. It was just boys being boys. And so that I remember where I was mentally with that. It was just fun. And if you got hit in the head, whatever, you're a kid, you'll bounce back. But this was more acting out what they experienced, the children across the street. And my wife and I were both like, wow, it's just interesting. So I think that may lend to what you're saying. Some of that, I guess, is natural, because again, I can remember as a child, just we would beat each other up or have, whatever. And so I came from a violent family, parents and stuff like that. There was a lot of arguing, violence, stuff like that going on. So maybe that's my contribution. But I had other kids in the neighborhood that may not have had that much. So it's weird. I mean, but yeah, I think children see it, they absorb it. And then like the 3 boys that you said you were in custody of, or custodial to, yeah, it's no wonder.
It come back to our original understanding. If we're coming back to ideas about consciousness, and if you take it, or if you accept the idea that we are born into this world for a purpose, part of a cosmic purpose. I want to be really clear that I kind of see the cosmos as having a purpose, but within that we each have our own place. And that when a child is born into this world, then for me, the responsibility of every parent, as well as for every significant carer in that child's life, is to create an environment which enables that child to become the person they were born to be. And I think that's really important, and that's why partly why I pay a lot of attention to early years environments and to primary schools. But the reality is many children get abused, much like you did, and you've moved beyond that and you've come into a different place. But if people don't have those opportunities, there can be a risk of perpetuating, which is why I think education is so important throughout life. I'm very much into the idea of lifelong learning and education being there at all ages, which is, I guess, why I educate mainly adults, but with the importance of children. But we all need to have an opportunity to kind of get back into in tune with what we were born to do. And I'm sure, there are many people probably on this call who kind of feel a sense of either I'm living out the life I was here to do and this is how I'm going to progress it, or perhaps I'm getting off course a bit and how do I get back on track again. And I think that's where ideas of being with others, meditation or group reflection, dialogue, being in contexts where people can openly talk and share these things. Historically, I didn't have a chance in my early life. The opportunities weren't there, but I think there's an increasing awareness in certain parts of society anyway, of the need to have these kind of conversations and create these kind of environments where people can share their internal experiences, their previous experiences, and begin to progress their understanding of themselves and the lives we experience. And for me, this is all part of this idea of an evolution of consciousness that we're all a part of, we're all integrated within.
Mm-hmm. And in acknowledging what you've just said, I would invoke the idea or the metaphor of the daimon and the will living through us. So I'll get Schopenhauerian for a second, but I like that metaphor of the daimon. And to bring Jung back into the conversation for a moment, that yes, if the universe or whatever the central unitary nature of mind or consciousness is willing, that not shunting, but the dysfunctionality that arises from that is further complicated by the will wanting to move through that young emerging person, but there is psychological dysfunction going on there, which to me becomes sort of this reciprocity of misfortune or tortured life, because the will is there in you throughout your life, but if you are damaged, and I speak plainly, like, I was messed up for years, and I was very self-abusive, but it all manifests in its own way. But the daimon was not expressing itself through me, and it probably got kind of pissed with me because I'm just literally wasting time and just spinning my wheels. So that's just, yeah, it's complicated. And yeah.
And I love the concept of the daimon as well. And of course, Bernardo Castro talks about this a lot, and talks about how it's influenced him and his life. But I think you've got to get to a certain stage of life where, as you say, you can actually hear your daimon. I mean, I think it's been there for me throughout, in a sense, not consciously until later on, but in many ways, I've lived quite a privileged life. And although I've had challenges and times when I've been depressed and down and struggled, if I look at it in terms of other people that I've known who've really had traumatic, abusive childhoods, which in that sense I didn't have, then it's how can you, when you're struggling just to survive emotionally each day, even get a sense of what the daimon's saying to you. So again, that's why I think we just need to look out for each other. And I really do feel this idea of collaboration, that we need to learn to relate at a closer level with each other. We need to learn to acknowledge the inner worlds of other people and begin to share. I was brought up in a family where you didn't talk about your private life at all. You didn't talk about your inner life. It wasn't the done thing, it's somehow taboo. And I think it wasn't till I did my PhD, actually, through the encouragement of my supervisor, that I began to see, so what's the benefit to me of not sharing what's happened to me? Somebody has said to me quite recently, actually, that if you share those parts of yourself, it gives permission for other people to share parts of themselves also, and so we become free and more liberated, and I think that's going to be the way to allow us to move on, and then perhaps we're more able to hear that voice of the daimon and follow it. But we need to support each other in this. It's life can be very lonely for many people, and another of my mantras is that separation is an illusion, and I don't think we are at all separated from each other. And I think that the challenges or the purpose is how we connect and reconnect with each other, and provide each other with the support that we each need to be what we were born to be in this life.
Yeah, for me, it's worth looking back in time at the species as it's gone from infancy to what I would consider our adolescence right now, as a species, and to be aware that the reason we survived is because of interconnectedness, because we were extended families that migrated until we settled down 12,000 years ago. We migrated around where the food was, and we had to rely on each other. Yeah, we'd go to war with other extended families, but when we were in these tribal units of less than 100 people or whatever, that there was that cohesion. And you can see it. There's so many documentaries out there now of what we would call Neolithic cultures, but man, they've got it together in that sense. There's no strong linear hierarchy. There may be a shaman, there may be a matriarch or something like that, but everybody knows their business and what they need to do in that culture, and it's throughout the planet. It's consistent, and that, I certainly don't suggest we revert to that, but it's that we can be inspired by that cohesion that's there. We've had the violence of immediate connectivity in the last 100 years or so, whatever you want to mark the time, that we are now a global colony or eusocial batch of creatures. I don't know, whatever we are, that we have to sort that out. And I call it violence because, there's 8 billion people who are suddenly exposed to each other. Whereas before we were used to, we slowly crept up with small cities and, small organized. That's a reference to Taxi Driver. Freudian slip there. But anyway, so yeah, my point is that, we have to sort that out, I think, in acknowledging where we've come from, where we are now, and what, if we have a future, what do we do to make sure that we ensure that we do have a future, or at least that the children being born now have a future, to be able to
I'm
sort
an
all that out.
optimist ultimately. I mean, you look around, I don't watch the news. I don't
Yeah,
put
same
on-
here. Too
because
much.
if I do, I feel my consciousness is being filled with all the negativity. And actually, because I know so many people who are involved in their own journeys, and we're having conversations like this, and there are other conversations like this taking place in many different places. So I'm a great believer ultimately that positive energy will triumph in the end. I'm always reassured by the myths, where the myths are always a kind of battle against good and evil, and it gets manifest in lots of films as well as history. And you think you're absolutely certain till the last minute that evil is going to win, that the bad guy is going to get through, and then just something happens finally where actually the good is stronger than the evil. So despite how things are happening in this world at the moment, I just experience the individuals and the small groups and the increasingly larger groups who are representing something much bigger, much greater, what I think are kind of expressions of what I understand to be the ultimate reality of this universe. And so I'm optimistic that we will win through, and that we're on part of this evolutionary process that's at a level of consciousness, not just in terms of our physicality.
Yeah, I if you pushed me, I would say I'm optimistic, but guardedly optimistic in the sense that. But I think there are these sort of spontaneous moments in our human history where weird shifts take place, and I think, as you just said, these kind of conversations and the dialogues and where they go in the world and who they meet and who they impress. And there's a lot, that's all I watch. Like you, I don't watch the news anymore. I take enough in just to know kind of what's going on, but I just try to stay away from a lot of the details. But yeah, just tuning into this kind of solution-oriented thinking is what I call it. So there's conflict-oriented behavior and dialogue and so forth, but there's also solution-oriented, and that's what turns me on mentally, is to hear people talking about, well, yeah, we all know kind of what's going on in the problem sphere, but now let's sort this out and understand. And one thing that, again, going back to us all sort of being thrust together as a large community, is that as individuals, like you and I, can look to the future, we can problem solve, we can predict, we can model what something might look like. But I think it breaks apart a little more as we get into larger scales of populations, that we freeze. Let's say there's fight, flight, freeze. I think when we tend to freeze up when we think about eco-crisis or water scarcity or nuclear holocaust or totalitarianism or authoritarianism on the rise, we kind of get into this kind of freeze mode, and then we go off to utopia. We want to go to Disney, and that's where, like, we get into transhumanism or false or weird religions or weird cultural phenomena, just to try to sort of offset the horror. So, but I think if we can understand that there's a need for scaling in terms of, and there are people doing this. I'm not saying that this is a huge void, but I just focusing on things like that, focusing on like there's even this weird like long-termism and things like that, where they're just looking ahead and saying, okay, we do have logical steps that we can take to mitigate X, Y, or Z or whatever. So that's where I'm optimistic, is that we do have good faith, problem-solving people, and good-hearted people, empathetic people who will immediately find that to be relevant and necessary and supportive of it. So that's where I'm hopeful, is that, you know, we just ignore the static, because a lot of times all the doom and gloom is brought to us by, you know, Boeing or Rice Krispies or Coca-Cola. You know, it's all advertising revenue that drives a lot of this sort of doomsaying that we get out of the news and the media. They're doing it to hijack our amygdalas so that we watch more news, and, you know, they get to sell ads and things like that. So we could just sort through a lot of these little details. I think we can. There's a way out. There's a through way. And so I'm with you. I totally agree that we're not doomed. You know. So.
No, and I think my optimism also comes from a deeper place, probably in the ontology, which I have come to believe in because I feel I've experienced it. And so, if you know, you said earlier on in this conversation, actually, that you were agnostic. And even as you said it, it made me think, because it's an interesting word, agnostic. And how would I respond to that? And at the moment, I think I would say probably, you know, I do have a belief system, I do have a faith, but it's not the same as the one that I was brought up in. So I was actually brought up I was the daughter of Church of Scotland missionaries. And so I was born in Africa. So I was brought up in a very, very strict Christian religion, and just took it for granted for the first 16 years of my life. And then I was going to confirmation classes and ended up walking out of them, because suddenly it just dawned on me, you know, can I really believe this? And I kind of checked out with the vicar. If I can't believe this, should I be getting confirmed? And
right.
he looked at me oddly. I don't think
Continue.
had anyone said this to him before. And he said, well, I suppose not. So I walked out, and I was fine with it. It was my mother. You know, what got me about this was that my mother was horrified, because she just felt my soul was going to be at risk. And I knew my soul wasn't at risk. And that was a very early lesson, because here I was with the person who, you know, was loved me completely as their daughter, but thought my soul was at risk, and I didn't. So what do we mean by knowing? I knew it wasn't, and she knew it wasn't. So that had quite a kind of statement. So in that sense, I became atheist, but I also couldn't adhere. I've always had an instinctive reaction against the materialism of science. So I wasn't a believer in the material basis of the world either. And that really confused me until I read Carl Jung's autobiography, which is what opened me up to a different way of understanding the world. And then when I did go to university, I did a year of different religions, different interpretations, and got introduced to all the Eastern religions as well as modern interpretations of Christianity. So that opened me up to kind of say, oh gosh, there's all kinds of possibilities. Well, I've never adhered to one specific religion. So in sense of there being an external God, I am definitely an atheist. But and for a long time I would have used that word agnostic for myself. But as I've progressed on this personal journey and feel that you know, I've had some really tough things happen to me, and yet I'm still here speaking optimistically. And my sense is that there is some deeper level of reality that holds us and cares for us. And if we're prepared to stay with it and take it as valid, take that kind of underpinning, caring, loving reality to our lives as a real thing, and work with it, then actually positive things happen. And the other thing I've taken from Carl Jung, and actually we've talked about off camera, is the incidence of synchronicities. So there have been very amazing synchronicities in my life, which suggests that there's a kind of coincidence of the psychic and the physical. So I actually feel now, at the age that I've got to, is that this idea of this loving, compassionate ground to my being is actually real. That doesn't mean to say that I don't think that the universe that we might just not go into self-destruct. But even if we did self-destruct on this particular occasion, I really do believe that deeper reality would just come back again and start recreating in a different way, and that there is an ultimate purpose to the whole of the cosmos. So I think I can say, and it took me a long time to do this, Justin, I think I can say that I have a belief in that. And so the idea of the divine actually has some kind of meaning to me, not in terms of an external, not in terms of the God that I was brought up with, but in terms of an intrinsic meaning to the universe that is ever present. I think I've decided that I'm no longer agnostic.
So, and that's, and I like how you delivered that, because it's a journey. And so I'll express a similar journey. So yeah, I rejected the Sky Father. I'm an ignostic to the Sky Father idea. I think he was a rabbi, or he was a Jewish scholar or something, and he coined that term ignostic. It's like, it's not even worth having that conversation. Just forget about it. You know, I'm not even going to bother. But when I invoked agnosticism earlier, it is a step that I make in what is essentially perhaps a circular method, in that, and we probably talked about this in our pre-meet, is I love apophasis and apophatics, and I love Pyrrhonian skepticism, so that I would never ever want to apprehend anything too tightly. And so that in being in a state of fluid agnosticism, to say I can't know, or to say I can't judge, or that I cannot land on, as John Vervaeke calls it, a propositional tyranny of some kind, where I'm firmly entrenched and you better agree with me or you're at it, you know, that kind of thinking. That's where my agnosticism shows up, is that I can hold ideas to be true, which, if the etymology of true is faith, and so I'm true to you in this conversation that we are entering into a good faith. So for me, true is that sense of being in a relationship, being in faith, of wanting the best, the true, the good, and the beautiful. So when I invoke agnosticism, it is partially to affirm how you've used it, but also that it is a process for me, that I arrive back at the mystery, but I am hands off with the mystery. So I never put a definition on. That's the apophasis. Like, I could never know. And I'm good with that. And so when I surrender to that, then beauty shows up to me. I told you off camera that, or off the record, that I finally found Sri Anandamaya Ma the other day, and it was just so beautiful. I found this person. The Hindus thought she was the divine mother incarnate, but just in that imposition, she's just this beautiful creature, and she's transformed how many lives because of that. And that, to me, is divinity, when humans get together in a consensual practice and acknowledge the truth, the good, and the beauty. It doesn't matter what the wiring under the board is, or all the other stuff that's going on beyond our, peripheral vision. It's that I trust the process. So agnosticism has to be in there. So I can't say, well, God is a chunk of iron rock that sits up, it's like, no. So anyway, just to clarify.
Yeah, and let's just be really clear. I haven't got a defined belief system in that sense. I mean, I think the last page of my thesis, in fact, acknowledged the mystery. I've been on this search, and actually I have to acknowledge that I'll never know, certainly in this life at this point in time, what is. I need to accept the mystery. Yeah. I need and move on with that. I suppose when I say I'm not agnostic, I just believe that there's something we're moving towards. I have got no idea what that is or what that looks like. I'm not even attempting to explain it. Yeah. I'm not attempting to define it or to conceptualize it. It's just, when I say lack of agnosticism, my understanding of agnosticism is that you're not sure whether there's something that exists beyond our five senses, or whether we're just all bits of matter. And I think what my senses and my belief is that we're moving towards, or we are part of, or whatever language you use. I'm not even saying my way of phrasing it is particularly good, but we are part of a bigger reality, and we're progressing towards something more meaningful. But I wouldn't claim to begin to articulate or conceptualize what that is.
Yeah, no, we're on the same exact page. So I too am not agnostic in that regard. But again, I am epistemologically agnostic. Like I'm just not bright enough to solve all of the physics that's going. I don't have that faculty. So therein, I have to be agnostic because I don't know quantum mechanics. I don't know relativistic physics. It's like I'm agnostic. I'll take what somebody says. I'll process it and I'll make it palatable for me. So yeah, so you're right though. I mean, it's such a complex and dynamic word, and though, but it is only a step I make. To be.
But it's why it's so important to clarify concepts, isn't it? Because actually I get a sense we're talking much more about similar things, but it would be so easy to have that word agnostic divide us. I am, you're not, and language has its uses, but it can be a barrier as well. And I do like to be very careful to try and get a sense of at a deeper level where people are connecting when they apparently are being divided in terms of language.
And I think that's a big stumbling block in somewhere in the gulf between solution and problem-oriented thinking. And then when people get together in good faith to have solution-oriented conversations. And we've seen this in bringing our friend Bernardo back into this conversation, that he'll go into debates with people like, I might have been Christoph Koch or somebody like that. And consciousness is two different things to these folks. Bernardo, again, is the noun consciousness that we've kind of been discussing, but there's also the verb conscious, the action, the consciousness that is employed. And so there's this semantic quagmire that we can find ourselves in sometimes, which is fine, because that's what good dialectic is to sort these matters, and go through a dance with somebody and you arrive. And I've mentioned Vervaeke a few times. He's good with that. He's good with sorting these kind of things out and trying to make clear what it is we're discussing and clear what our goals and intentions are. And he enters into what he calls dialogos with people. And that's a beautiful, and some people call him a rhetorician. And I think that's fine, because how do you deliver a good sermon? How do you impress upon people values and judgments and things like that? Having that skill is good. And it can be used for bad, of course, but I think he employs it for the better. So language is key in that regard. And speaking of language, I had to, and not to derail our stream that we were just in, the relational pedagogy that you had referenced earlier, there was something in my looking at your work, you called it the triangle of trust. And maybe this could unfold into what we're talking about. What is the triangle of trust when it comes to a relational pedagogy?
Well, this came out of the research that we did in the early year settings that I talked about earlier and doing with Janice. And we were talking about the triangle of trust specifically in that context between the parent, the child, and the practitioner. And very often in context, these different roles will be very separate. But we're saying about the importance, and we are locating it within a kind of idea, an ontology of a participatory consciousness. So the whole paper is about how we introduce this idea of consciousness that is just not brain orientated within our educational context with early years. And actually really very pleased that this got published, because this is a mainstream education journal. It was Education 3 to 13, and I don't think it would have got published 2 or 3 years ago, because we are challenging existing ideas of consciousness and bringing this notion of a participatory consciousness in, and then providing an argument about what that means for working with young children. And it has huge implications for the relationship between parent, child, and practitioner, which means that in those settings, there's an active attempt to ensure that they're relating at a deeper level, that they're bonding with the child at a deeper level. And we explore what that means, because so often in those contexts, for example, the parent will just come in, will drop off the child at the door, will go away, the child goes in, one practitioner picks them up, another does, and it can be about just separate individuals going about and living their existence out, rather than seeing themselves as being kind of internet connected, and that relational being the primary factor, influencing factor about what happens in early years settings day in, day out. But it's just another, we use that concept of the triangle of trust we really are just saying that in any context we go into, the relational is really important. How you establish those relations, those connections with other people, how you see them as. And we're just involved in another project, or getting involved in an intergenerational project, which research, you know, young children, a nursery in a kind of residential setting for older people. And the examples are really, really simple. Some of them, someone was talking about, you know, going up to an older person, and not just, you know, how in many settings, either in hospital or care or something, there'll be a trolley of tea taken around, and the tea gets poured out and given to the person. And in this context, someone goes up and says to the, you know, has a few words with the older person and says, would you like some tea, and how would you like it, and do you want it weak or strong, and actually personalizes the whole thing to make it a meaningful exchange, so that it's not just about passing over that cup of tea to somebody. It's about ensuring that that has a kind of relational, that's a meaningful exchange with that person, and it just alters the whole ethos of it, really.
I'm glad I brought it up, because it meshes, I think, with what we were just talking about in dialogos and relationality and solution-oriented thinking, and that's speaks volumes to that. And I know in Japan they do that too, where they integrate senior facilities with, say, up to 6 years old or 7 years old daycare and kindergarten, and I just think that's so brilliant. You know, it's for me, it helps build what I find filial piety, or the reverence to the elders, to be important, and maybe in a dying art. And but it's essential, because again, that goes back to how we spent however many tens of thousands of years moving around the world, or just certain parts of the world, and that, you know, connecting with the elders. Now, of course, there's some of us old folks that the young people are just going to babble on about things, but in there is the opportunity to connect. And as I like to say, that old people are messengers from the future, you know, and they're always going to have something. They'll know what it's like to be 20. They'll know what it's like to be 30, and it's fairly universal. And so I think if children and teenagers, sometimes you just can't penetrate their wall, but if it starts out at an early age, and the young person's like, oh, this old codger has something interesting, you know, and I got something good from the old codger last year, or whatever, that they'll start to build up, and they won't call them old codgers anymore. They'll be like, oh, wise one, you know. And start learning.
The older I get, the less I understand about why older people become so written off or alienated, because, you know, if we live our lives as we should, the wisdom should increase by years, and the learning should add, you know, increase over time. And it says something very sad about our society, I think, that, you know, when a person retires, for example, they just go off and they're just seen as not being a valuable addition to society. And it's certainly in a project like this, you know, the research is about how do we enhance this? How do we make this a real community where the younger people and the older people have something to offer each other? So the older people have something to offer in terms of, you know, they might talk about their childhood, or they just might be and have the time and the patience to be with the child, and then the child can find some ways, and the way the relationships flourish are wonderful, actually. Because I carry in my mind another occasion of a residential setting, well, one of these managed accommodation places where the older people had their own flats and they had a shared lounge. And my experience there was the older people, you know, if somebody was going in with their grandchildren, there was an older person there who just didn't want the children to come because they might be noisy and they might disturb the neighbors, and there was this worry and anxiety about young children being noisy and giving them a bad name, and that's the opposite end of the spectrum, isn't it? That's separating. They're not only separating the children off and alienating them, but they're in a sense separating themselves off. And so yes, I think this every generation has something to offer other generations, both older and younger. And I think if we can move towards understanding and appreciating that and creating the environments where that can happen, it would be wonderful.
Yeah. I think that would be one of the mechanisms or systems that would facilitate a sense of connectedness and a sense of, a better grounding to the ontology that we speak to in this conversation, that there is this, as the Buddhists called it, the interdependence, I think, or whatever the phrases they use. It's a good metaphor, or the Indra's net, or whatever you want to call it, that we're connected in that sense.
Absolutely.
I know we've gotten, I think we're right in that space where we were saying, well, this would be one good conversation, and we'll certainly have you back for another one. But before we part ways, was there anything else you wanted to bring to the conversation, or anything you want to finish with, a concluding thought, or anything that you want to end this with?
No, I think I've just enjoyed this conversation with you, Justin, and meeting up. And as I say, I think it's conversations like these that are very reassuring in a sense, and give a sense of hope. And yeah, I'd welcome another one at a different time.
Okay. I'm planning on it already. And likewise, I very much enjoyed this conversation. Intuitively, I knew when I reached out to you that this would be a good and productive. And then when we talked to each other and found out we had some common interests and some common aims and directions that we're looking in, that this would manifest a nice conversation in it. And I believe that was the case.
And shared synchronistic experiences
yeah,
as well.
Like to the audience, we both have blue shirts on today, and we didn't talk about that. So yeah, I love those synchronicities. So all right, well, Joan, thank you so much for the insights and sharing your background with us, and what you have to offer the world, and what you've offered in this conversation. I'm very grateful for that. So thank you for being with me.
Thank you, Justin, and thank you for organizing these webinars.
Yeah, absolutely. It's my little thing I can do for the world. So to the YouTube audience, I'll say thank you very much. I appreciate you being here. That we usually have about 9 to 10% retention at the end of a conversation. So for all of you that stuck into the end, thank you so much. Joan, I'll say goodbye to you after we're stopped recording. But thank you, YouTube folks. Appreciate it, and we'll see you on the next one.
Thank you too.
Take care. Bye-bye.